I counted my father's breaths for 42 days. 42 days of hospital coffee that tasted like burnt plastic and regret. 42 days of sleeping in a vinyl chair that stuck to my skin every time I shifted. 42 days of watching the man who raised me disappear one shallow breath at a time. And then I stepped into the hallway to call the nurse about his pain medication. 3 minutes. That was all it took. 3 minutes to explain that the morphine wasn't enough anymore, that he was grimacing in his sleep, that something needed to change. I could hear the exhaustion in my own voice as I described the way his fingers curled into fists whenever a wave of pain crashed through whatever dreams he was having. When I walked back into room 412, the monitor had flatlined. That sound will stay with me until the day I die. That long, continuous tone, the absence of the beeping that had become my heartbeat for 6 weeks. The silence that wasn't really silence at all, but something worse. Something final. I grabbed his hand. It was still warm, almost warm. The warmth was leaving him even as I held on like water draining from a bathtub, like the last light fading from a winter sky. And I remember thinking that if I had just waited 3 more minutes to make that call, I could have been holding his hand when he left. I could have told him I loved him one more time. I could have heard whatever final words he might have whispered. Instead, I was arguing with a nurse about milligrams. 3 minutes. That is the weight I carry now. That is the distance between me and goodbye. My name is Ren Ashford. I was 24 years old when my father died, and I was completely alone in that hospital room when it happened. Not because there was no family. There was plenty of family. They just couldn't be bothered to show up. My father, Edmund Ashford, built Ashford Rail Freight from a single freight contract into one of the largest private rail logistics companies on the East Coast. He started with a used pickup truck and a handshake deal with a regional distributor who needed someone reliable to move grain from the Shenandoah Valley to the ports of Norfolk. By the time I was born, he employed over 2,000 people and owned more rail yards than I could count on both hands. But success didn't make him hard. That's what I remember most about my father. He could walk into a boardroom and command respect from men twice his age. He could negotiate contracts worth tens of millions of dollars without breaking a sweat. He could fire underperforming executives with a calm certainty that left them thanking him on their way out the door. But he could also sit on the floor of my childhood bedroom and play tea party with my stuffed animals. He could spend an entire Saturday teaching me to ride a bicycle, running alongside me with his hand on the seat until I found my balance. He could read me the same bedtime story 15 nights in a row because it was my favorite, and he never once complained about the repetition. He never forgot where he came from. He never forgot what mattered. When the pancreatic cancer diagnosis came, it moved fast. The doctors gave him 6 months. He lasted 5. The cancer was aggressive, they said. It had already spread to his liver by the time they caught it. There were treatments they could try, but they were buying time, not curing disease. I moved into that hospital room on day 1. I brought my laptop so I could grade my students' art projects between his treatments. I brought my sketchbook so I could draw while he slept. I brought a change of clothes and a toothbrush and the stubborn belief that if I just stayed close enough, I could somehow hold death at bay. My brother Sterling visited 3 times during those 42 days. The first visit lasted 18 minutes. He stood in the doorway wearing a charcoal Armani suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary. He checked his phone every 30 seconds, his thumb swiping across the screen with the practiced rhythm of a man who measured his worth in unread emails. Our father was awake for that visit. I watched Sterling lean down to kiss his forehead, like he was fulfilling an obligation, like he was checking a box on his busy schedule, like he had somewhere more important to be and was counting the seconds until he could leave. He asked about the company, about the transition plan, about whether Dad had signed the latest corporate documents. He didn't ask how Dad was feeling. He didn't ask if there was anything he could do. He didn't pull up a chair and sit down and just be present with the man who had given him everything. 18 minutes, and then he was gone. The second visit was 12 minutes. Sterling didn't even take off his coat. He came straight from the airport, he said. He had a flight to catch in 2 hours, he said. He just wanted to check in, he said. He asked about the will. Our father was sleeping. Sterling didn't wait for him to wake up. The third visit was exactly 1 week before Dad died. 15 minutes. Sterling brought flowers from a gas station. I know they were from a gas station because the price tag was still on the cellophane. He took a photo of himself placing the flowers on the windowsill, posted it to his Instagram with the caption, "Family First," and a prayer hands emoji. Then he left before I could even say goodbye. 45 minutes total. That's how much time my brother invested in our dying father. 45 minutes across 42 days, less than 4 minutes per week, less time than he probably spent choosing his ties each morning. My sister Margot never came at all. She sent flowers once, expensive ones from a high-end florist in Richmond, the kind that come in a crystal vase with a handwritten card on thick cream-colored paper. The card said, "Thinking of you, Daddy. Get well soon. XOXO Margot. Get well soon from pancreatic cancer." When I called her to ask if she was coming home, she told me she was at a spa resort in Switzerland. She said the trip had been planned for months. She said the stress of Dad's illness was affecting her mental health. She said she needed to prioritize self-care. She said she would video call him when she got back. She never video called. Not once in 42 days. Not once while our father lay dying in a hospital room 3,000 miles from the Swiss Alps, where she was getting hot stone massages and drinking champagne and posting photos of herself in a white bathrobe with mountains in the background. My stepmother, Vivian, visited regularly, but her visits were performances rather than presents. She would sweep into the room in designer clothes that cost more than most people's mortgages. She would arrange herself artfully at my father's bedside, positioning her face near his so the afternoon light caught her cheekbones just right. And then she would hand me her phone and ask me to take photos for her social media accounts. Prayer hands emoji, #blessed, #family first, #fighting cancer together. Then she would kiss my father's forehead, wrinkle her nose at the hospital smell that no amount of flowers could mask, and return to her penthouse in downtown Richmond. Back to her life of charity galas and spa appointments and lunches with her equally wealthy friends. Vivian had been married to my father for 21 years. She had never loved him. Everyone knew it except my father, who had a blind spot the size of Texas when it came to the woman he chose to replace my mother. My mother, Lenora, died when I was 3 years old. I don't remember her face without looking at photographs. I don't remember her voice without imagining it. I don't remember the way she smelled or the way she laughed or the way she held me. All of that was stolen by a postpartum complication that should have been caught, would have been caught if someone had taken her to the hospital sooner. My father never talked about the details of her death. When I was young, he would simply say that Mama got sick and the doctors couldn't help her. When I got older, I stopped asking because I could see how much pain the questions caused him. His eyes would go distant, his jaw would tighten, and I loved him too much to keep reopening that wound. But when I was old enough to seek answers on my own, I learned the truth from hospital records and old letters that I found in a box in the attic of our Richmond home. Vivian had been in the house when my mother collapsed. Vivian, who was still just my father's executive assistant at the time, who had been nursing an obsession with him for years, who saw my mother as an obstacle to her ambitions, who wanted my father and his money and the life that my mother was living. The records showed that Vivian waited 4 hours before calling an ambulance. 4 hours. She told the doctors she thought my mother was just tired. She said she didn't want to disturb Edmund at work. She said she didn't realize how serious it was. She said all the things that a person says when they're trying to explain away something inexplicable. My mother bled to death on the floor of our living room while Vivian made excuses. 3 years later, Vivian became my stepmother. 2 years after that, she gave my father 2 children of his own blood, Sterling first, then Margot. The children she believed deserved the Ashford fortune, the children she raised to see me as an inconvenience, an interloper, a reminder of the woman she had replaced. I grew up in the margins of my own family. My stepmother threw elaborate birthday parties for Sterling and Margot, bouncy castles and pony rides and custom cakes from the best bakery in Richmond, professional photographers and catered food and guest lists that included half of Virginia's social elite. My birthdays were forgotten more often than they were remembered. Once when I was 7, my birthday fell on the same week as Margot's graduation from elementary school. Vivian threw Margot a party that lasted 2 days, tents on the lawn, a petting zoo, fireworks on the second night that I watched from my bedroom window because no one had invited me to join the celebration below. She forgot my birthday entirely. That night my father came to my room at midnight. He was carrying a small chocolate cupcake with a single candle, the flame flickering in the darkness of the hallway. He sat on the edge of my bed and lit the candle. "Make a wish, Wren," he whispered. I closed my eyes and wished for my mother. I wished for her to come back. I wished for her to walk through my bedroom door and scoop me up in her arms and take me away from this house where I never felt wanted. When I blew out the candle, my father held me tight. He smelled like aftershave and oak and something deeper, something that felt like safety. "You are everything good your mother left in this world," he said. "You are my treasure. Never forget that." I never forgot, but I also never stopped wishing I had more. More memories of being chosen, more evidence that I mattered, more proof that I wasn't just a leftover daughter from his first marriage tolerated but not truly wanted. Those 42 days in the hospital were the longest my father and I had spent together since I left for college. Between his cancer treatments and my grading, between his sleeping and my sketching, we talked more than we had in years. He told me about meeting my mother at a train station in Philadelphia. She was playing piano in the waiting area, a battered upright that the station had set up for travelers to use. A tip jar beside her collecting coins and crumpled bills from strangers who stopped to listen. She was earning money for her last semester of college, he said, working every angle she could find to pay her tuition without taking on more debt. He said her fingers moved across the keys like water flowing downhill, effortless and inevitable. He said he missed his train because he couldn't stop watching her play. He said he sat on a wooden bench for 3 hours listening to her work through Chopin and Debussy and a jazz piece she made up on the spot when someone in the crowd requested something upbeat. He told me about their courtship, how he came back to that train station every day for a week until she agreed to have dinner with him, how he brought her flowers every day for a month after that first date, how she told him he was crazy and he said he was crazy about her, and she laughed so hard that coffee came out of her nose. He told me about their wedding, a small ceremony in her parents' barn in rural Pennsylvania. Her family was poor, he said, farmers who had lost their land during the previous recession, but they welcomed him like a son. They served homemade apple pie and danced to fiddle music until midnight. They didn't care that he was rich. They cared that he loved their daughter. He told me about the day I was born, how my mother held me for 3 hours before letting anyone else touch me, how she counted my fingers and toes over and over again like she couldn't believe I was real, how she sang to me constantly, even in the delivery room, even when she was exhausted and sore and barely conscious. The same lullaby over and over, a song about lavender and loyalty and love that never ends. "Lavender's blue dilly dilly," my father whispered, his voice cracking from the cancer that had spread to his throat. "Lavender's green. When I am king, dilly dilly, you shall be queen." I held his hand and cried. On the 39th day, my father had a moment of clarity. The morphine haze lifted. The confusion that had clouded his eyes for weeks suddenly cleared. And he looked at me with eyes that were sharp and present and desperately urgent. "Wren," he said, "I need you to listen." I leaned closer. My heart was pounding. I could feel that this moment was important, that he was gathering the last of his strength to tell me something he needed me to hear. "Brierwood," he whispered. "Don't ever sell Brierwood." Brierwood was the family estate, a crumbling Victorian mansion in the Shenandoah Valley that had been in the Ashford family for 4 generations. I'd only been there 3 times in my life. I barely remembered it. "Everything you need is there," my father continued. His voice was fading. His eyes were starting to cloud again. "Everything I couldn't give you openly." "Lenora," his voice trailed off. His eyes drifted toward the ceiling. His hand went slack in mine. "Dad." I squeezed his fingers. "What about Mom?" But he was gone again, drifting back into the morphine sea. whatever he wanted to tell me about my mother, whatever connection existed between her and that old house in the mountains. He couldn't hold on long enough to explain. He never finished that sentence. I didn't know what he meant about Brierwood. I didn't know what my mother had to do with anything. I didn't know what he couldn't give me openly or why he was mentioning a house that hadn't been occupied in nearly a decade. 3 days later, he was dead, and I missed his last breath by 3 minutes. The funeral was a spectacle. Vivian wore a black Chanel dress and a hat with a veil that she lifted dramatically whenever photographers were present. She dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief and accepted condolences with the gracious nods of a woman who had rehearsed her grief in front of a mirror. Sterling delivered the eulogy. I sat in the front row and counted. He mentioned himself 17 times. He mentioned our father 8. He talked about the company and its future and his own plans for expansion. He talked about legacy and responsibility and the weight of carrying forward what our father had built. He barely talked about the man himself, about his kindness, about his laughter, about the way he made everyone around him feel valued and seen. It was a business presentation disguised as a eulogy. Margot flew in from Switzerland, wearing sunglasses she never removed, claiming the bright lights bothered her eyes. She air-kissed Vivian and nodded at Sterling and looked right through me like I was a window she couldn't be bothered to close. She left immediately after the reception for a connecting flight to Monaco. She didn't stay for the burial. I sat in the front row wearing a sweater my father had given me years ago. It was gray wool, slightly itchy, and it still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco he used to smoke on the back porch when he thought no one was watching. I had found it in his closet at the hospital and wrapped myself in it like armor. No one spoke to me. No one offered condolences. No one acknowledged that I had spent 42 days watching him die while they lived their lives unchanged. The reading of the will took place 2 weeks after the funeral. The law offices of Holloway and Associates occupied the top floor of an old brick building in downtown Richmond. The building was a century old, with marble floors worn smooth by generations of expensive shoes and mahogany paneling that gleamed with the patina of old money. The kind of hushed atmosphere that suggested wealth and power, and the careful distribution of both. Clement Holloway, my father's attorney for 30 years, sat behind a desk the size of a small car. He was 74 years old, with white hair that swept back from a high forehead and wire-rimmed glasses that perched on a nose that had clearly been broken at least once in his youth. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the manila envelope containing my father's final wishes. I wondered if the trembling was from age or from what he was about to read. Vivian sat to my left, dabbing at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. She was wearing black again, though her version of mourning included diamond earrings and a pearl necklace that probably cost more than my car. She looked like a woman attending a slightly disappointing opera rather than a woman hearing her husband's last wishes. Sterling sat to my right, checking his phone every few seconds. He was already wearing a suit that looked more like CEO than Morning Sun. He barely glanced up when Clement cleared his throat. Margot had arrived late, complaining about traffic, though I suspected she had simply slept in. She took a seat at the end of the row and immediately began examining her manicure with the focused attention of someone who had more important things to think about than inheritance. "Let us begin," Clement said. "The first bequest went exactly as I expected. To my beloved wife, Vivian Edmond left $6.5 million in liquid assets, savings accounts and investment portfolios and bonds that had been accumulating interest for decades. He also left her the penthouse apartment in downtown Richmond where she had lived throughout their marriage. 4,000 square feet of luxury with views of the James River and a private elevator and a rooftop garden that she had never once visited because she didn't like to get dirt under her fingernails." Vivian received the news with a theatrical gasp and a whispered prayer of gratitude. She pressed her handkerchief to her heart and looked toward the ceiling as if communing with my father's spirit. "To my son, Sterling Edmond, left 50% of the outstanding shares of Ashford Rail Freight, controlling interest in a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He also left $8 million from various investment accounts in the vacation home in the Outer Banks, 5 bedrooms, private beach access, and a dock with space for 3 boats. Sterling smiled. It was the smile of a man who had known this outcome all along, who had been waiting for it with the patient certainty of a predator watching its prey grow weaker. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging that the universe had finally recognized his worth. To my daughter, Margot Edmond left the remaining 50% of company shares, equal controlling interest with her brother, $8 million in bonds and securities, and the antique jewelry collection that had belonged to Edmond's mother. My grandmother pieces that dated back 4 generations and were probably worth another $1 million on their own. Margot squealed with delight, clasping her hands together like a child receiving a birthday present. She actually bounced in her chair. Her grief from the funeral apparently forgotten in the face of 8 figures and family heirlooms. I sat perfectly still, waiting. Knowing what was coming couldn't possibly be as bad as what I was imagining. To my daughter, Wren Ashford, Clement read his voice slowing noticeably. The room went quiet. Even Sterling looked up from his phone. Even Margot stopped bouncing. I bequeath Brierwood Manor and the entirety of its content, structures, and associated property rights. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sterling burst out laughing. The sound was sharp and cruel, echoing off the mahogany walls and the marble floors and the portraits of distinguished lawyers that lined the room. He covered his mouth with his hand, but the laughter kept coming, his shoulders shaking with barely suppressed glee. Brierwood, he managed to say between gasps. That pile of rubble. She got the haunted house, Margot giggled behind her hand. Oh, Wren, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. I'm so sorry. That place has been falling apart for years. Maybe you can charge admission for ghost tours. Vivian smiled. It was the thin, satisfied smile of a woman whose chess pieces had all landed exactly where she planned them. 21 years of positioning, and she had finally won. I sat frozen in my chair, unable to process what I had just heard. Brierwood Manor. The family estate that I had visited exactly 3 times in my life. The Victorian nightmare that had been abandoned for 8 years, ever since my grandmother passed away. The historic landmark that couldn't be demolished no matter how badly it was deteriorating. I knew what Brierwood was. I knew that the roof leaked in a dozen places, that the windows were broken and boarded up with plywood, that black mold had claimed the east wing and was spreading through the walls like a cancer of its own, that local teenagers used it for Halloween parties and travelers whispered about ghosts in the hallways. I knew that the property taxes alone were $34,000 a year. I had approximately $9,000 in my savings account. My father had given me a life sentence disguised as an inheritance, a crumbling mansion I couldn't afford to maintain and couldn't legally destroy, a burden that would drain every penny I ever earned and leave me bankrupt within a year. The meeting ended in a blur of handshakes and false condolences. Sterling and Margot filed out together, already discussing their plans for the company. They were talking about expansion and acquisition and strategic partnerships, their voices fading down the marble hallway as they walked toward their bright, wealthy futures. Vivian followed them, pausing only to pat my cheek with patronizing sympathy. Don't worry, dear, she said. I'm sure you'll figure something out. You always were resourceful. The word resourceful dripped from her lips like poison, like she was reminding me of my place, like she wanted me to know that while her children had received their birthright, I had received exactly what I deserved, nothing. Then she was gone, leaving me alone with Clement Holloway and a single brass key. Miss Ashford, the old lawyer, said softly. Would you wait a moment? I looked up. I hadn't realized I was crying until I felt the tears dripping from my chin onto my gray wool sweater. My father's sweater, the only thing I had left of him now. Clement was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His trembling hands were folded together on the desk. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the afternoon light from the window behind him. Your father left me with a message for you. Only for you. He was very specific that I deliver it privately after the others had gone. I waited. My heart was pounding again, the same way it had pounded on day 39 when my father had gripped my hand and whispered about Brierwood. He said to tell you find the place where Lenora used to watch the sunset. I frowned. Lenora, my mother? Those were his exact words. He wouldn't explain what they meant, but he was very insistent. He made me promise to deliver them to you, and only you. Clement paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. He also said that you would understand eventually, and that he was sorry he couldn't give you more openly, but everything he wanted you to have is waiting at Brierwood. I stared at the old lawyer, searching for meaning in his careful expression, but Clement Holloway had spent 50 years protecting the secrets of wealthy families. His face gave nothing away. I don't understand, I said. Neither do I, Clement admitted. But your father was a careful man, Miss Ashford. He planned everything years in advance. If he gave you Brierwood, he had a reason. And if he left you a message about your mother, there was something he wanted you to find. I looked down at the brass key in my hand. It was old and heavy, with teeth worn smooth by generations of use. The key to a crumbling mansion I couldn't afford. The key to a mystery I didn't understand. The key to everything my father couldn't tell me while he was alive. 3 weeks later, I drove to Brierwood. The drive from Richmond took 4 hours. I drove my 10-year-old Toyota Corolla with the windows cracked open, letting the November air whoosh away the stale scent of hospitals and funeral homes that seemed to have permanently embedded itself in my hair and skin. The highway gave way to smaller roads. The smaller roads gave way to winding mountain paths. The suburbs dissolved into farmland, then forest, then the kind of wild rolling terrain that reminded me how big this country actually is, how much space exists between the cities where most of us spend our lives. The Shenandoah Valley stretched before me in waves of brown and gold. The trees were just past peak autumn color, their remaining leaves clinging stubbornly to branches that would be bare within weeks. The mountains rose blue in the distance, layer after layer of ridges fading into haze. I had been to Brierwood exactly 3 times in my life. The first time I was 5 years old. My grandmother Elizabeth was still alive, and we visited for Thanksgiving. I remember a vast house filled with dark furniture and heavy curtains, the smell of wood smoke and roasting turkey, the sound of my grandmother's voice reading me a story by the fireplace while the adults talked in another room. I remember feeling safe in a way I rarely felt at home in Richmond. The second time I was 11. My grandmother had just died, and we came for the funeral. The house was cold and empty, sheets draped over the furniture like ghosts. Vivian complained the entire time about the dust and the drafts and the lack of decent restaurants nearby. We stayed one night and never returned. The third time I was 16. My father drove me up for a weekend, just the 2 of us. It was the only time I ever had him completely to myself without Vivian or Sterling or Margot demanding his attention. We walked the grounds together. He showed me the old stable where his grandfather had kept horses built from the same gray stone as the main house. He showed me the stone bench behind it, overlooking the valley. This was your mother's favorite place, he said. She used to sit here every evening and watch the sunset. She said the colors reminded her of the hymns her mother sang in church, purple and orange and gold. I hadn't thought about that conversation in years, but now, driving toward Brierwood with Clement's cryptic message echoing in my mind, I remembered it with perfect clarity. Find the place where Lenora used to watch the sunset. The town of Millbrook appeared first. It was exactly the kind of small American town that time seems to have forgotten. A single main street lined with brick buildings, most of them a century old. A white Lutheran church with a tall steeple. A hardware store with hand-painted lettering on the window. A diner called the Blue Ridge Cafe with red vinyl booths visible through the glass. Population 3,500 according to the faded sign at the town limits. I pulled into the parking lot of Hensley's Mercantile to stretch my legs and buy water for the last leg of the journey. The store was a general store in the old-fashioned sense, with wooden floors that creaked under my feet and shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to fishing tackle to sewing supplies. It smelled like coffee and leather and something sweet that might have been penny candy. The woman behind the counter was in her early 70s with silver hair pinned up in a bun and a calico apron over her dress. She had the kind of face that had seen a lot of life and decided to keep smiling anyway. She watched me approach with open curiosity. Passing through, she asked, "Actually, I'm heading to Brierwood Manor," I said. "I inherited it. I'm Wren Ashford." The woman's eyebrows shot up. "Edmund's daughter. You knew my father knew him." The woman laughed. It was a warm sound that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Honey, everybody in Millbrook knew Edmund Ashford. He might have lived in Richmond, but his heart was always here." "I'm Opal. Opal Hensley. My husband's family has run this store for 4 generations." She came around the counter and took my hand in both of hers. Her grip was strong and warm, the hands of a woman who had worked hard her whole life. "I was sorry to hear about your father," she said. "He was a good man, better than most people knew." "Thank you," I said. Opal studied my face with an intensity that made me want to look away, like she was seeing something beyond my surface, like she was looking for someone else in my features. "You have her eyes," she said finally. "Lenora's eyes, same color, same shape. I remember her, you know. She used to come into this store every week when she was pregnant with you. She always bought lavender soap and peppermint candy." Something tightened in my chest. "You remember my mother. Hard to forget her. She was the kindest person I ever met. Always had a smile for everyone. Always knew exactly what to say to make someone feel better. She would talk to anyone, rich or poor, young or old. She treated everybody like they mattered." Opal shook her head slowly. "Losing her, that broke something in your father. I don't think he ever really recovered. He kept coming back to Brierwood every few months, walking the grounds alone. Never stayed long. Never spoke to anyone. Just walked and walked like he was looking for something he couldn't find. I wanted to ask more questions. I wanted to ask everything. About my mother, about my father's visits, about what he might have been looking for on those solitary walks. But the afternoon was fading, and I still had miles to drive. "I should go," I said. "But maybe, could I come back?" "To talk more about her?" Opal smiled. "Honey, you come back any time. We've got 20 years of stories about your mama, and I suspect you're going to need friends in this town." I didn't understand what she meant by that. Not then. The driveway to Brierwood was half a mile long. Oak trees lined both sides, their massive branches forming a canopy overhead. The late afternoon light filtered through the remaining leaves, casting shifting patterns on the gravel below. The trees had been planted over 100 years ago by my great-great-grandfather, a railroad magnate who had built Brierwood as a summer retreat for his family. The gravel crunched under my tires. The shadows deepened as I drove. And then suddenly, the trees parted. Brierwood Manor rose before me like a ghost from another century. It was Italianate Victorian in style, with tall arched windows and a central tower, and a wraparound porch that extended across the entire front facade. The house was 3 stories tall, not counting the attic with 48 rooms spread across nearly 10,000 square feet. Once it had been magnificent. Now it was dying. The white paint had peeled away in long strips, revealing gray, weathered wood beneath. The roof sagged in several places, and at least a dozen windows were boarded up with plywood. Ivy had climbed the eastern wall and colonized the entire wing, prying into the masonry, pulling the stones apart from within. The wraparound porch tilted at an alarming angle on the southern end. The front steps had collapsed entirely, leaving a gap like a missing tooth in the house's smile. I sat in my car for a long moment, staring at the ruins of my inheritance. This is what my father had left me. This is what my siblings had laughed about. This is what I was supposed to maintain on a teacher's salary or face fines I could never pay. But somewhere in this crumbling wreck, my father had hidden something. Something he couldn't give me openly. Something connected to my mother. I got out of the car. The November wind was cold up here in the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and decomposing leaves and something else. Something older, The smell of a house that had been closed up for 8 years, slowly rotting from the inside out. I walked around the collapsed front steps and found a side entrance, a servant's door that had been left unlocked probably by local teenagers who used the house for parties. The door groaned when I pushed it open, and a wave of stale air washed over me. Inside, Brierwood was a tomb. White sheets covered the furniture like shrouds. Dust lay thick on every surface, disturbed only by the tracks of small animals that had made the house their home. The wallpaper was peeling, the plaster was cracking, and water stains spread across the ceilings like dark continents on a faded map. But beneath the decay, I could see what the house had been. The carved mahogany banisters intricate with leaves and vines. The crystal chandelier hanging in the entrance hall, its prisms dulled by dust but still catching the fading light. The intricate tile work in the foyer, geometric patterns in blue and white that must have been imported from Italy a century ago. The soaring ceilings, the grand proportions, the bones of something beautiful. The bones are good. That was the phrase my father had used during our visit when I was 16. He had walked through the crumbling rooms with me, pointing out the original hardwood floors, the hand-carved moldings, the massive stone fireplaces. The bones are good, Ren, he had said. This house just needs someone to love it back to life. I hadn't understood then. I had been 16, more interested in boys in art school than in old houses with no internet and no cell service. But now, standing alone in the dust-choked twilight, I felt something stir in my chest. This house was my mother's favorite place. This house had been in my family for 4 generations. This house was mine. And somewhere within its walls, my father had hidden the truth about everything. I found a room on the ground floor that was relatively intact, a small parlor with heavy velvet curtains still hanging at the windows. I swept the dust off the floor with a broom I found in a closet, unrolled the sleeping bag I had brought, and spent my first night at Brierwood. The wind howled through broken windows. The old house creaked and settled around me. Strange sounds echoed through the hallways. Footsteps that weren't footsteps. Whispers that weren't whispers. The normal noises of an ancient building talking to itself in the dark. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't leave either. In my pocket, the brass key pressed against my thigh, and in my mind, my father's words played on endless repeat. Find the place where Lenora used to watch the sunset. Everything you need is there. Everything I couldn't give you openly. Tomorrow I would find the stone bench behind the stable. Tomorrow I would sit where my mother used to sit and watch the sunset paint the valley in purple and gold. Tomorrow I would begin searching for whatever my father had hidden. But tonight I lay in the darkness of my crumbling inheritance and listened to the house breathe around me. And for the first time since my father died, I felt something other than grief. I felt hope. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The next morning I walked the grounds. Brierwood sat on nearly 4,000 acres of wilderness. Mountains rose to the north, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the season. A creek cut through the property to the south, its banks lined with sycamores and willows that had dropped most of their leaves into the water. Old farm buildings dotted the landscape like memories made of stone. A smokehouse with a collapsed roof, a spring house built over a natural spring, a massive stable that had once held dozens of horses. The morning air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of frost and pine and the particular sweetness of decaying leaves. My breath made small clouds in front of my face as I walked. The grass was stiff with cold beneath my boots. I found the stone bench behind the stable exactly where I remembered it. 8 years of neglect had done their work. The bench was covered in lichen and moss, half hidden by overgrown wild roses that had sent thorny branches sprawling in every direction. The roses had once been cultivated, I could tell. Someone had planted them here, deliberately creating a bower around the bench. But without pruning, they had gone wild, turning beauty into barricade. I pushed aside the thorny branches, ignoring the scratches on my hands and arms. The view took my breath away. The Shenandoah Valley spread out below me, mile after mile of rolling hills and farmland, and distant mountains fading into blue haze. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber. Mist rose from the valleys like smoke from 1,000 invisible fires. In the far distance, I could see the town of Millbrook, tiny as a child's playset. This was where my mother used to watch the sunset. This was the place my father wanted me to find. I sat there for a long time, feeling the cold stone beneath me, wondering what I was supposed to discover. The bench was solid rock, immovable. The ground around it was packed earth and wild grass. There was nothing here but an old seat and a beautiful view. Then I noticed the flagstone. It was part of a small patio area in front of the bench, a semicircle of flat stones that had been laid decades ago to create a level surface. Most of the stones were worn smooth by weather, and time their edges rounded their surfaces covered with the same lichen that claimed the bench. But one stone was different. The color was wrong, slightly lighter than the others. The edges were too sharp. It looked newer than everything around it, as if it had been replaced more recently than the others. I knelt down and pressed on the stone. It shifted. My heart began to pound. I pried at the edges with my fingers, breaking my nails, not caring about the pain. The stone was heavy, maybe 40 pounds, but it wasn't mortared in place. It lifted, revealing a shallow hollow beneath. Inside the hollow was a tin box. The box was old but well preserved, protected from the elements by its stone roof. I lifted it out with trembling hands and brushed away the dirt. The tin was green with age, decorated with faded flowers that might once have been roses or peonies. I opened the lid. Inside the box, I found 3 things. The first was a photograph, black and white, slightly yellowed at the edges, but still clear. It showed a young woman in a white summer dress sitting on this very bench, smiling at the camera. She was beautiful in a simple, natural way, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders, and dark eyes that seemed to hold some private joy. Her smile radiated warmth. It was the first clear photograph I had ever seen of my mother's face. Vivian had removed all pictures of Lenora from our house in Richmond years ago. She claimed they made my father too sad. She said it wasn't healthy to dwell on the past. She packed them away in boxes that somehow got lost during a renovation that never happened. But here was my mother, young and alive and beautiful, sitting in this exact spot looking at whoever held the camera with an expression of pure happiness. The second item was a small leather journal, its pages yellowed but legible. The handwriting inside was delicate and feminine, written in blue ink that had faded to gray in places. I recognized nothing about the penmanship, but I knew immediately whose words these were. My mother's handwriting. My mother's thoughts. My mother's voice preserved on paper for 21 years. The third item was a piece of paper newer than the others, folded twice. I recognized my father's sharp, precise script immediately. The ink was still dark. This had been written recently, perhaps in the months before his death. If you find this, go to the stable. Last stall. Wooden floor. The song Lenora sang. I clutched the photograph to my chest and let the tears come. For several days, I did nothing but read. I sat in the parlor with my mother's journal, the November rain pattering against the windows, and I learned about the woman who had given me life. Lenora had been born in rural Pennsylvania, the daughter of farmers who had lost their land during the recession. She had worked her way through college, playing piano in train stations and hotel lobbies, earning tips in a mason jar while her classmates went to parties and football games. She had met my father when she was 22, and he had fallen in love with her the moment he heard her play. She wrote about their courtship with shy delight. Edmund brought flowers every day for a month, she wrote, roses and lilies, and once when the florist was closed, a handful of wildflowers he picked from the side of the highway. He says I saved him from a life of loneliness. I tell him I saved myself. He laughs like I'm joking. I'm not. She wrote about their wedding, a small ceremony in her parents' barn with homemade pies and fiddle music and dancing until midnight. Her father walked her down the aisle between hay bales wrapped in white ribbon. Her mother cried through the entire ceremony and then served 3 kinds of pie at the reception. I wore my grandmother's dress, she wrote. It was too long and slightly yellow from age, but Edmund looked at me like I was wearing diamonds. He told me I was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. I believed him. She wrote about moving to Virginia, about discovering Brierwood for the first time, about falling in love with the stone bench behind the stable and the view of the valley, and the way the sunset painted the mountains in colors she had no names for. I sit there every evening and watch the world turn gold, she wrote. Edmund thinks I am watching the sunset, but really I am talking to God. I am thanking him for this life I never expected to have. She wrote about her pregnancy, about the joy of feeling me kick inside her, about the names she was considering, about the lullabies she sang to me every night, the same song her own mother had sung to her. Lavender's blue, she wrote, dilly dilly, lavender's green. When I am king, dilly dilly, you shall be queen. My mother sang this to me every night until I was too old to want lullabies anymore. Now I sing it to the baby growing inside me. I hope she will sing it to her own children someday. And then in the final pages she wrote about Vivian. She watches me with hungry eyes, my mother wrote. She thinks I do not notice. She thinks I do not see the way she looks at Edmund when she thinks no one is watching. But I see. I know what she wants. She wants my life. She wants my husband. She wants to erase me and take my place. The entries grew darker as the pages turned. I found something today, my mother wrote. I was looking for last year's tax documents in Edmund's office, and I found a file that Vivian had left on his desk. She must have forgotten to put it away. Inside were bank statements, transfers, money moving from company accounts into personal accounts that do not belong to Edmund. She has been stealing. For years, it seems. Small amounts at first, then larger. She has built herself a fortune while pretending to be a loyal assistant. I do not know what to do. If I tell Edmund, he will confront her, and I am afraid of what she might do. There is something in her eyes when she looks at me. Something cold. Something that makes me lock my bedroom door at night even when Edmund is traveling. I copied everything. The statements, the transfer records, the account numbers. I hid the copies where she will never find them. If something happens to me, I want there to be evidence. I want someone to know the truth. The final entry was dated 3 weeks before my mother's death. I confronted her today, my mother wrote. I do not know what came over me. Perhaps the pregnancy hormones. Perhaps the exhaustion of pretending not to see what I see. I told her I knew about the money. I told her I had copies of everything. I told her that if she did not stop, I would tell Edmund. She smiled at me. That was the most frightening part. She did not deny it. She did not beg for mercy. She simply smiled like I had walked into a trap she had been setting for months. If something happens to me, I pray that someday my daughter will find these words. I pray that someday Ren will know the truth. I'm going to hide this journal where Vivian cannot find it. I'm going to put it in the place I love most in the world, the place where I talk to God every evening and thank Him for my blessings. If you are reading this, my darling daughter, know that I loved you before you were born. Know that I sang to you every night. Know that your father loved me and I loved him, and we both loved you more than anything in this world. And know that whatever Vivian told you about my death, it was a lie. I closed the journal with shaking hands. My mother had known. She had known about Vivian's schemes. She had gathered evidence. She had confronted the woman who wanted her life. And 3 weeks later, she was dead. The hospital records I had found years ago came flooding back. Vivian had been in the house when my mother collapsed. Vivian had waited 4 hours before calling an ambulance. Vivian had told the doctor she thought Lenora was just tired. My mother bled to death on the floor of our living room while Vivian watched, and then Vivian married my father and raised her children to hate me and spent 21 years enjoying the life she had stolen. The stable was massive, built from the same gray stone as the main house. It had been designed to hold 30 horses with individual stalls lining both sides of a central corridor. The roof was still intact, though several windows had been broken by storms or vandals. Dust motes floated in the shafts of sunlight that penetrated the gloom. The last stall was at the far end, shrouded in darkness, even in the middle of the day. I brought a flashlight and examined every inch of the wooden floor. The planks were old but solid, worn smooth by generations of hooves and boots. I pressed on them one by one, searching for any that felt loose or hollow. Nothing moved, nothing shifted. The song Lenora sang, "Lavender's blue dilly-dilly, lavender's green." I looked more closely at the planks. They were marked with small brass numbers worn almost invisible by time. Stable inventory markers, probably for tracking which stall held which horse. But as I studied the numbers, I noticed something strange. Several planks had letters scratched into the brass instead of numbers. Faint letters almost invisible that could have been random marks or could have been something more. Lavender. My heart nearly stopped. I pressed the planks in order. L first. Nothing happened. Then A. A soft click, barely audible. V. Another click. E. The sound grew louder. Nder. When I pressed the final plank, a section of the floor shifted and rose on hidden hinges, revealing a dark stairway leading down into the earth. I descended into the darkness. The stairway was narrow and steep, carved directly into the stone foundation of the stable. The air grew colder with every step. The walls were rough-hewn rock, damp to the touch. At the bottom, my flashlight revealed a small underground chamber, perhaps 15 feet square, with a vaulted ceiling and rough stone walls. In the center of the chamber stood an antique safe. It was old, probably early 20th century, with brass fittings and a heavy iron door. It looked like something from a museum exhibit about the Gilded Age, the kind of safe that belonged in a Wild West bank or a Prohibition-era speakeasy. The safe was unlocked. I pulled open the door, and the beam of my flashlight illuminated a treasure beyond anything I could have imagined. The first thing I saw was a stack of documents carefully preserved in acid-free folders. Old paper, yellowed but still legible, covered in dense legal text and elaborate corporate seals. I pulled them out carefully and began to read by flashlight. They were stock certificates, original stock certificates for Ashford Rail. Freight, dated 1923, issued to my great-great-grandfather and held in trust ever since. 35% of the founding shares represented by physical paper documents that had never been registered in any modern system. These were bearer instruments, worth whatever the holder could prove them to be worth. Based on the current valuation of the company, these certificates represented somewhere between $12 and $15 million. Beneath the stock certificates, I found another stack of documents, deeds of ownership for mineral rights covering the entire Brierwood property, limestone deposits that had never been mined, water rights to underground aquifers that supplied half the farms in the valley, mining claims that had been quietly renewed every decade since 1891. The mineral rights alone were worth between $25 and $40 million, depending on the buyer. My hands trembled as I realized what I was holding. My father had not left me a crumbling house. He had left me a fortune that no one else knew existed. But that was not all. At the bottom of the safe, I found a large envelope. The paper was newer than the other documents, crisp white bond sealed with red wax. My father's handwriting spelled out my name on the front, Wren. Inside the envelope was a thick stack of papers, contracts, bank statements, wire transfer records, corporate filings, and a letter. "Wren, my darling," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone and you have found what I spent 20 years hiding. I know you must be confused. I know you must be hurt. I know you expected more from me while I was alive, and I'm sorry I could not give it to you openly. But everything I did to protect you. Vivian has been stealing from this family since before you were born. Your mother discovered her schemes 3 weeks before she died. Lenora copied the evidence and hid it, planning to confront me with the truth. But Vivian found out what Lenora knew, and then Lenora was dead and the evidence disappeared. I did not know any of this until years later. By then, Vivian had covered her tracks. She had married me. She had given me 2 children who called her mother, and she had been whispering poison in their ears since they were old enough to understand. Sterling and Margot are not innocent victims. They grew up watching their mother steal, and they learned from her example. By the time they joined the company, they were already scheming to take everything for themselves. What you hold in your hands is the evidence of their crimes. Sterling has been taking kickbacks from labor unions and embezzling from the employee pension fund. $4.2 million over the last decade. He convinced himself it was victimless. He told himself the workers would never notice. But 2,000 families are counting on that pension fund for their retirement. Margot has been evading taxes through a network of shell companies in the Caribbean. $6.8 million hidden offshore. She learned the technique from a college friend whose father went to prison for the same crime. She thought she was smarter than he was. Vivian has been running fake charitable organizations to launder money from various business dealings. $3.1 million diverted through phantom foundations that exist only on paper. I could have exposed them at any time. I could have gone to the authorities years ago. But I wanted them to dig their own graves. I wanted them to feel safe so they would keep stealing. I wanted them to believe that I was a foolish old man who could not see what was happening under his own roof. 6 months before I died, I quietly reported everything to the SEC and the IRS. I gave them evidence. I gave them timelines. I gave them enough to begin investigations that would take months to complete. And then I wrote my will. The shares and assets I left to Sterling and Margot are not gifts. They are evidence. Those specific accounts and holdings are the ones they used to commit their crimes. By accepting the inheritance, they accepted legal ownership of the fraud. The investigations will conclude within a year. When they do, your siblings will face federal charges. The assets they inherited will be seized. And you, my dear daughter, will have the only legitimate fortune the Ashford family ever possessed. I'm sorry I could not explain this to you while I was alive. I could not risk Vivian finding out. She has been watching me for years, waiting for me to make a mistake. If she had known about this safe, about these documents, she would have found a way to destroy everything. But you, Wren, you I could trust. You never asked for anything. You never schemed or plotted. You stayed by my side when I was dying, asking nothing in return. You are everything good your mother left in this world. You are my treasure. Wait for the investigations to conclude. Do not act too quickly. Let justice do its work. And know that I have always, always loved you, your father, Edmund. I sat in the underground chamber for a very long time. The flashlight battery grew dim, and I sat in the gathering darkness clutching my father's letter to my chest, crying tears I had been holding back for months. My father had not abandoned me. My father had been protecting me all along. And my father had spent 20 years planning the most elaborate revenge I could imagine. The discovery changed everything, but it also put me in danger. 3 weeks after I found the underground chamber, I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps. Not the creaking of an old house settling, not the scurrying of mice in the walls. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, moving through the ground floor directly beneath my bedroom. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, my heart pounding so hard I was certain whoever was downstairs could hear it. The footsteps moved from the parlor to the library, from the library to the kitchen. Doors opened and closed, drawers scraped against their runners. Someone was searching for something. I crept to the window and peered out through a crack in the curtains. A black Mercedes was parked at the end of the driveway, its lights off, nearly invisible in the darkness. The footsteps began to climb the stairs. I grabbed my phone and slipped into the closet, pressing myself against the back wall, barely breathing. Through the slats of the closet door, I watched shadows pass across the hallway. 2 men, both wearing dark clothes, both carrying flashlights. Their faces were hidden by ski masks. "Check the bedrooms," one of them said. His voice was rough, impatient. "Sterling says there has to be a safe or a lockbox somewhere. The old man definitely hid documents here. Find them." Sterling. My brother had sent them. I stayed in that closet for 2 hours listening to them tear through the house. They searched every room on the upper floors. They pried up floorboards in the hallway. They knocked on walls listening for hollow spaces. They even went through the boxes of my grandmother's old belongings that I had not yet sorted. But they did not know about the stable. They did not know about the stone bench behind it. They did not know about the underground chamber hidden beneath the last stall protected by a password only I could know. When they finally left, cursing their failure, I waited another hour before moving. My legs were numb, my hands were shaking, but my mind was sharp with the clarity that fear sometimes brings. At first light, I gathered every important document from the safe and drove through the morning mist to Charlottesville. I rented a safety deposit box at a regional bank that had no connection to the Ashford name. I deposited the original stock certificates, the mineral rights documentation, and my father's letter. Then I made photocopies of everything and mailed one set to Clement Holloway with explicit instructions about what to do if anything happened to me. On my way back to Brierwood, I stopped at Hensley's Mercantile. Opal was behind the counter, and she pulled me aside before I could even say hello. Her face was serious. The warmth I had seen in our first meeting had been replaced by something harder, something protective. "There's been a man asking about you," she said, her voice low. City type, expensive suit, drove a black Mercedes. He wanted to know if Brierwood had any outbuildings, any underground storage, any place someone might hide valuables. My blood ran cold. "What did you tell him?" "Told him I had lived in Millbrook my whole life and never heard of any such thing." Opal fixed me with knowing eyes. "Whatever you have got hidden up there, honey, you keep it hidden. And you watch your back. Some people in this world will do anything for money." That afternoon, I called the Tate farm. Harlan Tate owned the property directly adjacent to Brierwood, a working cattle ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations. He was 70 years old with a weathered face and hands like old leather and a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. His voice on the phone was exactly the kind of voice you want to hear when you're scared and alone. His son Sawyer answered on the 3rd ring. "I need help," I said. "Security cameras, motion sensors, better locks, anything you can install quickly." Sawyer did not ask questions. He didn't need to. By nightfall, Brierwood had a basic security system, and I had the first real sense that I was not alone in this fight. Over the following days, I got to know my neighbors. Harlan Tate became a regular visitor to Brierwood. He would drive over in his old Ford pickup ostensibly to check on the security cameras his son had installed, but really just to sit on the porch with me and drink coffee and tell stories about my father. "I knew Edmund since we were boys," Harlan said one afternoon, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of orange and purple. "We used to fish together in the creek that runs between our properties. He was different from most rich folks. Never looked down on anyone. Always remembered where he came from." "I didn't know you were so close," I said. "Your daddy helped my family once." Harlan's voice grew quiet. The kind of quiet that comes before a story someone has been carrying for a long time. "Back when Sawyer was 10, we were about to lose this ranch. Bank was ready to foreclose. We had missed 3 payments in a row after a bad year with the cattle." He paused, took a sip of his coffee, looked out at the mountains. "Edmund showed up one morning with a check for $50,000. No paperwork, no interest, just a handshake and a promise that we would pay it back when we could." "Did you pay it back?" I asked. "Took us 15 years, but every penny." Harlan smiled. "But your daddy never cashed the checks. I found them all in a drawer after he died, still sealed in their envelopes. He did not want the money. He just wanted to help." Harlan's wife, Della, became another regular presence at Brierwood. She would drive over with casseroles and pies and practical advice about surviving winter in the mountains. She taught me how to use the wood-burning stove in the kitchen. She showed me where to find the well water pump when the power went out. She helped me hang heavy curtains over the drafty windows. "Your mama used to help me can vegetables every fall," Della told me one afternoon as we sat in the warming kitchen drinking coffee from mismatched mugs. She was a city girl when she came here, did not know the first thing about preserving food or keeping a garden, but she learned fast. Della's eyes grew distant with memory. Lenora was like that, determined to master whatever was in front of her. She would show up at my kitchen door with her notebook and her questions, and by the end of the season she was teaching me things about pickling that my own grandmother never knew. I soaked up every story like a sponge. Every detail about my mother was a gift I had been denied my entire life. Sawyer was 29, a carpenter and blacksmith who had inherited his father's practical skills and his mother's warmth. He started helping with the restoration work, arriving most mornings with his tools and a thermos of coffee. "Let me help," he said when I tried to pay him. "Your daddy helped my family when we needed it most. This is how we pay it back in Millbrook. We take care of each other." The break-in had been a warning. My brother knew something valuable was hidden at Brierwood. He just did not know what or where. And as long as I kept my secrets close, he never would. I thought about going to the police. I thought about confronting Sterling directly. I thought about driving to Richmond and throwing my father's letter in his face. But my father's words echoed in my mind. Wait for the investigations to conclude. Do not act too quickly. Let justice do its work. So I waited. I rebuilt, and I trusted that the trap my father had set would spring exactly as he intended. The weeks turned into months. Winter came to the Shenandoah Valley, burying Brierwood under 2 feet of snow that sparkled in the weak December sunshine. I learned to chop wood and keep fires burning and survive in a house that still had more holes than walls. Sawyer came almost every day. We worked together on the most urgent repairs, focusing on the rooms I actually used while leaving the rest of the house to wait for spring. He was patient and kind and funny in a quiet way that made the long winter days bearable. We didn't talk about what we were becoming. We didn't need to. Some things just happen like water finding its way downhill, effortless and inevitable. Opal kept watch in town. She reported every stranger who asked questions about Brierwood, every black Mercedes that passed through, every phone call to local businesses inquiring about the Ashford property. Sterling's people came twice more during those winter months. The first time they were stopped at the gate by the new lock Sawyer had installed. They sat in their car for an hour watching the house, then drove away. The second time they tried to approach through the woods. The motion sensors picked them up half a mile from the house. Sawyer and Harlan met them at the property line with shotguns and hard stares. They left without a word. My brother was getting desperate, but he was running out of time. In early spring, Opal showed me a newspaper article from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, a small story buried in the business section. Something about federal investigators looking into irregularities at a major rail logistics company. No names were mentioned, no charges had been filed, but I knew. The trap was closing. I sat on my mother's bench that evening and watched the sunset paint the valley in purple and gold. The lavender I had planted around the bench was just beginning to sprout tiny green shoots pushing through the cold earth. I thought about my father in his hospital bed whispering about Brierwood and my mother and everything he could not give me openly. I thought about my mother at this very bench, writing in her journal about the woman who wanted her life. I thought about Sterling and Margot and Vivian, counting their stolen millions, never suspecting that every dollar was evidence of their crimes. And I thought about what my father had written in his final letter. Wait for the investigations to conclude. Do not act too quickly. Let justice do its work. I was done waiting for permission to be worthy. I was done hoping they would see me as family. I was going to let them destroy themselves with the weapons they had chosen. And when the dust settled, I was going to build something beautiful from the ruins they left behind. The spring sun was warm on my face. The valley stretched out below me, coming back to life after the long winter. And somewhere in Richmond, the investigators were gathering evidence that would bring my family's empire crashing down. I smiled. For the first time in months, I felt something like peace. 8 months after my father's death, Brierwood was unrecognizable. The house still needed years of work, but the transformation had begun. The roof no longer leaked. The windows had been replaced with glass that actually kept out the wind. The wraparound porch had been rebuilt sturdy and level with fresh white paint that gleamed in the summer sunshine. I stood on that porch every morning with my coffee, watching the mist rise from the valley below. The view never got old. The mountains changed color with the seasons, and the weather sometimes blue and distant, sometimes green and close, sometimes purple in the fading light of evening. My mother had watched this same view from her bench behind the stable. Now I understood why she loved it so much. The restoration had been possible because of careful legal work that most people would never see. Clement Holloway had connected me with securities lawyers in Charlottesville who specialized in authenticating historical documents. The original stock certificates from 1923 were a puzzle that took 3 months to solve. Forensic accountants examined the paper, handwriting experts verified the signatures. Corporate historians traced the chain of custody through 4 generations of Ashford family records. In the end, we succeeded. A small percentage of the founding shares were converted into liquid assets and sold to a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring legacy holdings. They paid fair market value, which turned out to be more than enough to begin critical repairs on Brierwood, while keeping the vast majority of my inheritance secure and untouched. I hired a local contractor named Wade Perkins, a quiet man in his 60s, who had done restoration work on historic properties throughout the Shenandoah Valley. He had gray hair cropped short and hands that were permanently stained with wood finish, and a way of looking at old buildings like they were patients in need of healing. Wade took one look at Brierwood and let out a low whistle. "This is going to take years," he said. "Then we better get started," I replied. We focused on the essential spaces first. The kitchen where I had learned to cook on the old wood-burning stove with Della's patient instruction. The parlor where I had spent my first night in a sleeping bag on a dusty floor. The library with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and massive stone fireplace that had not held a fire in nearly a decade. My bedroom on the second floor where I could see the mountains through windows that no longer rattled in the wind. The east wing remained closed off, still claimed by black mold and water damage. The third floor was untouched, its rooms frozen in time since my grandmother's death. But the bones of the house were good, just as my father had said, and slowly, room by room, we were bringing Brierwood back to life. I also got to know my neighbors in ways that went deeper than casual friendship. Harlan and Della Tate became the grandparents I had never really had. They invited me to Sunday dinners at their farmhouse, where Della served pot roast and mashed potatoes and pie made from apples she had picked herself. They told me stories about my mother, about my father, about the history of this valley, and the families who had lived here for generations. Opal Hensley became a constant presence as well. She organized fundraisers at her general store to help with the restoration. She spread word through the community that Brierwood was coming back, and that the daughter of Edmund Ashford was nothing like the step family who had stolen his company. People began stopping by to introduce themselves, to offer help, to share their own memories of my parents. I had never experienced community like this before. In Richmond, I had been invisible, the forgotten daughter, the leftover child from Edmund's first marriage. People looked through me like I was made of glass. Here in Millbrook, I was seen, I was known, I was welcomed. And then there was Sawyer. He came almost every day that spring and summer, helping with whatever needed to be done. He rebuilt the front steps with his own hands using timber he had milled himself from trees that had fallen on his family's property. He restored the iron hardware on the doors, heating the metal in a forge he had built behind his parents' barn. He worked in a way that was both efficient and careful, treating the old house with respect, like he understood that some things are worth preserving. We didn't talk about what was happening between us. We didn't need labels or definitions. We just existed in each other's space, learning each other's rhythms, finding comfort in each other's presence. One evening in late June, we sat on my mother's bench together, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of purple and gold. The lavender I had planted was blooming now, filling the air with its soft, sweet scent. The wild roses had been pruned back and were covered in pink blossoms. I told him everything that night, about the safe beneath the stable, about my father's letter, about the trap that had been set for my siblings, about the investigations that were closing in on everything they had built with stolen money. Sawyer listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Your daddy was a smart man," he said finally, "but he was also a kind man. He could have exposed them years ago, could have sent them to prison while he was still alive to watch, but he waited. He made sure you would be protected first." "I know," I said. That is love, Sawyer said. The kind that puts someone else's safety above your own satisfaction. The kind that plans 20 years ahead. The kind that keeps secrets to protect the people who matter most. He took my hand in his. His palm was rough from work, warm from the fading sun. You are not alone anymore, Ren. Whatever happens next, you have people who care about you. You have a place where you belong. I leaned my head against his shoulder and let myself believe him. The news broke on a Thursday morning in early August. I was in the kitchen making coffee when Opal called. Her voice was excited in a way I had never heard before. "Turn on your television," she said. "Channel 12, right now." I did not have a television. The restoration had not progressed that far, but I had my laptop and an internet connection that worked most of the time. I pulled up the local news website and saw the headline that changed everything. SEC investigates Ashford Rail Freight Company. Executives face fraud charges. Assets frozen as federal probe expands. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the article 3 times. Federal investigators had been examining the company's books for months. They had found evidence of securities fraud, pension fund embezzlement, and tax evasion at the highest levels of corporate leadership. Arrests were imminent. Assets had been frozen pending the outcome of the investigation. The article mentioned no names, but I knew exactly who they were talking about. Over the following weeks, the story unfolded in stages. First came the small articles in the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the kind that most people skip over on their way to the sports section. Then came longer pieces in the Wall Street Journal with detailed analysis of the alleged fraud and its impact on shareholders. Then suddenly, the story was everywhere. Sterling was the first to be arrested. I saw the photographs online. My brother in handcuffs being led from the corporate headquarters by federal agents. His face was gray and hollow, nothing like the confident executive who had laughed at me in the lawyer's office 8 months ago. His Armani suit was wrinkled. His hair was uncombed. His eyes had the wild, panicked look of an animal caught in a trap. 4 years in federal prison. That was the sentence for securities fraud and embezzlement from the employee pension fund. 4,000 families had been counting on that money for their retirement. My brother had stolen from every single one of them. Margot followed a week later. She tried to flee the country. I read about it in the newspaper, how she had booked a one-way ticket to a Caribbean island with no extradition treaty, how she had packed 2 suitcases full of jewelry and cash, how she had made it all the way to the airport before they caught her. Her passport was confiscated at the security checkpoint. She was placed under house arrest pending trial. Eventually, she received 3 years of probation and 1,500 hours of community service for tax evasion. The shell companies in the Caribbean were dismantled. The hidden money was seized. Vivian was last. The charges against her reached back decades: fraud, embezzlement, forgery, conspiracy, and though it could never be proven in court, the heavy implication that she had done far worse things than steal money. She was denied bail. Too much of a flight risk, the judge ruled. She had too many resources, too many connections, too many reasons to disappear. She would await trial in a federal detention facility wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of Chanel, eating cafeteria food instead of catered dinners. 6 years. That was the sentence when her trial finally concluded. 6 years in federal prison for the crime she had committed. The penthouse in Richmond was seized. The bank accounts were frozen. The life she had built on my mother's grave was dismantled piece by piece. I watched the news from Brierwood, sitting in the newly restored library, drinking tea from one of my grandmother's china cups. The fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace. Rain pattered against the windows. The house was warm and solid around me, a sanctuary I had built from ruins. I felt nothing. I had expected to feel triumph. I had expected to feel satisfaction or at least relief. But watching my siblings and stepmother dragged into the justice system, I felt only emptiness, a hollow space where anger used to live. They were strangers to me. They had always been strangers. Their downfall did not restore my mother to life. It did not give me back the years of feeling unwanted. It did not heal the wound of missing my father's last breath by 3 minutes. It did not fill the void of growing up in the margins of my own family. It just made them someone else's problem. On a Thursday morning in early September, I heard tires on the gravel driveway. Brierwood had been transformed over the previous months. The house gleamed white against the blue Virginia sky, its Victorian lines sharp and proud, its gardens bursting with color. The wraparound porch held rocking chairs where visitors could sit and watch the sunset. The stone stable had been cleared out and cleaned, awaiting the next phase of restoration. I was standing on the porch with my morning coffee when the BMW X7 came around the bend of the driveway. I knew who it was before the car even stopped. Sterling emerged first. He looked terrible. He had lost weight at least 20 pounds, and his expensive suit hung loose on his frame like clothes borrowed from a larger man. His hair was uncombed and graying at the temples in a way it had not been 8 months ago. His eyes were bloodshot and hollow, ringed with dark circles that spoke of sleepless nights and waking nightmares. This was not the man who had laughed at my inheritance. This was not the executive who had checked his phone every 30 seconds while our father lay dying. This was a shell, a husk, a man who had watched everything he built collapse around him. Margot followed him out of the car. She was wearing jeans and a plain white t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup, no jewelry, no designer handbag slung over her shoulder. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished somehow, as if the loss of her wealth had physically shrunk her. Vivian was not with them. She was still in federal custody, awaiting the outcome of her appeal. She would remain there for a very long time. Sterling stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking up at me with an expression I could not quite read. Desperation, maybe. Or fear. Or something that almost looked like shame. "Wren," he said, "we need to talk." I leaned against the porch railing, saying nothing. I sipped my coffee. I let the silence stretch. "The assets are frozen." Sterling continued. His voice cracked on the words. "All of them. The Fed seized everything. Our accounts, our properties, our investments. We have nothing." Margot stepped forward, her voice trembling. "We need lawyers, Wren. Good ones. Federal defense attorneys cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. We do not have it. We do not have anything." I remained silent. "You have to help us," Sterling said. The desperation in his voice was raw, undisguised. "Sell this place. Split the money with us. We are family, Wren. Blood is blood." I looked at my brother, at my sister, at the people who had mocked me at our father's will reading, at the people who had ignored our father while he was dying, at the people who had treated me like an inconvenience my entire life. "Family," I repeated softly. "Is that what we are? Please, Wren." Margot's voice cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks, real tears, the first genuine emotion I had ever seen from her. "I know we were not. I know we did not. But please, they are talking about years in prison. Years." I stood up from the railing and walked into the house. When I returned, I was carrying a folder. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, holding up the folder. They stared at me blankly. "This is a copy of our father's private journal. The one where he documented everything you have been doing for the past decade, every kickback, every shell company, every fraudulent transfer." I let the words sink in, watching their faces change. He knew Sterling. He knew about all of it. Sterling's face went gray. The color drained from his skin so completely that for a moment I thought he might faint. He swayed slightly on his feet, reaching out to steady himself against the porch railing. "Dad knew." His voice was barely a whisper. He knew, and he spent 20 years letting you dig your own graves. He left you the assets he knew were dirty. He let you accept them willingly, and then he watched from beyond the grave as the investigations he triggered closed in. I placed the folder on the porch railing between us. He also left me everything else, the original stock certificates from 1923, the mineral rights to this property, the legitimate fortune that you never knew existed. Margot made a choking sound. There was more, there was always more. I looked out at the restored grounds, at the lavender gardens, at the blue mountains rising in the distance. Father did not give me a crumbling house to punish me. He gave me a fortress. He gave me everything the Ashford family was supposed to be before people like you and Vivian poisoned it. Sterling took a step forward, his hands raised in supplication. "Ren, please. We are your brother and sister." Does that not mean anything? I considered the question. I thought about the birthday parties I was never invited to, the holidays where I ate alone in my room while they opened presents downstairs, the graduation ceremony where no one from my family attended, the 42 days I spent in that hospital room completely alone while my father died. I thought about my mother's journal, about the evidence she had gathered, about how Vivian had found out what Lenora knew, about what happened 3 weeks later. I thought about my father's letter, about how he had trusted me to carry out his wishes, about how he had believed I was different from the others. But I also thought about something my mother had written in her journal, about how she hoped her daughter would learn to forgive, not because the guilty deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to hatred made the heart too heavy to carry. I took a deep breath. "I am not going to help you escape what you did," I said quietly. "The evidence the FBI has is enough to convict you. Nothing I do or do not do will change that." Sterling started to protest, but I held up my hand. "But I'm not going to add to it either. I could give them this folder. I could provide additional testimony. I could make things much, much worse for you." I picked up the folder and held it out to them. "I am not going to do that. Take this. It is your copy. The FBI already has what they need from their own investigation. This is just closure, I suppose, for all of us." Sterling stared at the folder like it was a snake that might bite him. "I do not understand," Margot whispered. "Why would you help us?" "I'm not helping you," I said. "I'm letting go of you. There is a difference." I reached into my pocket and pulled out another document, a single sheet of paper folded twice. "This is a legal document renouncing any future claims you might have to Brierwood or its associated assets. Sign it, and we are done. You go your way, I go mine. We never have to see each other again." Sterling's jaw tightened. "And if we do not sign, then I might reconsider my generosity with additional evidence." It was not a threat, not exactly, but it did not need to be. Sterling understood leverage. He had used it against others his entire career. Now he was on the receiving end. He took the paper. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he processed the legal language. Then he signed. Margot signed too. Her hand trembled so badly that her signature was barely legible, just a shaky line of ink at the bottom of the page. They drove away without saying goodbye. I stood on the porch and watched the BMW disappear around the bend of the driveway. I listened to the sound of the engine fade into silence. I watched the dust settle on the gravel road. I never saw either of them again. 2 years later, Brierwood was a place of joy. The house gleamed white against the blue Virginia sky, its Victorian lines sharp and proud, its gardens bursting with color. The massive stone stable had been converted into an art studio filled with easels and supplies and the work of dozens of young artists. A hand-carved sign hung at the entrance of the property. The Lenora Ashford Center for the Arts, free instruction for children of the Shenandoah Valley. It had been my idea, but the community had made it real. Opal organized fundraisers at her general store, rallying the merchants of Millbrook to contribute what they could. Harlan and Della donated lumber and labor, spending weeks helping to convert the stable into a proper studio space. Sawyer built the interior with his own hands, working late into the summer nights, refusing any payment beyond dinner and conversation. The program served children from all over the region, kids from farming families who could not afford art lessons, teenagers from small towns where creativity was dismissed as impractical, young people who had been told their dreams were foolish, who had been laughed at for wanting to paint or draw or sculpt instead of doing something sensible. I taught watercolor classes every Tuesday and Thursday. I brought in guest instructors for pottery and sculpture and photography. I created scholarships for students who wanted to pursue art in college, funded by the mineral rights that had been sold to a conservation trust. 3 times a year, we opened the grounds for community festivals, music and food and art displays and dancing on the lawn under strings of lights. The kind of gatherings my mother would have loved. The kind of celebrations that brought people together and reminded them what mattered. The 3,800 acres of wilderness surrounding Brierwood had been designated as the Ashford Nature Preserve, open to schools and hiking groups and anyone who wanted to experience the wild beauty of the Shenandoah Valley. The mountains that had watched over my family for 4 generations would now be protected forever. Sterling had served his 4 years. He was released quietly without fanfare and disappeared into a life I knew nothing about. Margot had completed her community service and her probation. She had moved to a different state, I heard, starting over somewhere no one knew her name. Vivian was still in prison. She would be there for another 2 years at least. I didn't think about her often. I did not need to. She was no longer part of my story. On a summer evening 2 years after my father's death, I sat on my mother's stone bench and watched the sunset paint the valley in shades of purple and gold. Sawyer was beside me, his shoulder warm against mine. We had been together for nearly a year now, though neither of us had any interest in rushing toward labels or commitments. What we had was simple and honest and real. That was enough. The lavender was in full bloom around us, filling the air with its soft, sweet scent. The wild roses had been trained into graceful arches. The stone bench that had been hidden for years was now the centerpiece of a garden that my mother would have recognized, would have loved. "Your mama would have loved this," Sawyer said, looking out at the view. "I think she does love it," I replied. "Wherever she is, I think she has been watching this whole time." I held a cup of lavender tea in my hands, the steam rising into the cooling air. On my lap was my mother's journal, its pages worn soft from repeated reading. I knew every word by heart now, every hope, every fear, every prayer she had whispered for the daughter she would never see grow up. From the direction of the art center, I could hear children laughing. A group from the local elementary school was finishing their summer session, their parents arriving to pick them up. The parking area was filled with pickup trucks and minivans. The air was filled with the happy chaos of creative young people who had spent the afternoon making art. One of the girls came running across the lawn toward us. She was 7 years old, with red hair and freckles and a gap-toothed smile that lit up her whole face. Her name was Lily, and she had been coming to classes since the center opened. She had talent, real talent, the kind that showed up early and only needed nurturing to bloom. Miss Wren. Miss Wren. "Look what I made." She thrust a watercolor painting into my hands, bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. It showed a house, white with a blue roof surrounded by purple flowers. The proportions were off, and the colors ran together in places, but the joy in it was unmistakable, the love with which it had been made. "It is your house," Lily said breathlessly. "I painted it for you. Do you like it?" I looked at the painting, at this child's earnest face, at the life I had built from the ashes of everything I had lost. "I love it," I said, and I meant it with my whole heart. That night, after the children had gone and the sun had set and the stars had emerged in their millions, I sat alone in the restored library of Brierwood Manor. The room was warm now, heated by the massive stone fireplace that had been rebuilt to working order. The mahogany shelves held books again, some of them original volumes that had survived the years of neglect. Others that I had added myself. The antique safe from the underground chamber stood in the corner, no longer hidden, serving as a reminder of what had been preserved. I opened my mother's journal to the final entry. "I hope someday my daughter will find these words," she had written. "I pray that someday Wren will know the truth." I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. "Dear Mom," I found them. "I found your words, and I know the truth now. I know what you sacrificed. I know what you tried to protect. I know what you hoped for me. I wish you could see what I have built. I wish you could see the children learning to paint in the studio that bears your name. I wish you could see the gardens full of lavender, blooming purple and blue every summer, just the way you described them in your journal. I wish you could see the sunset from your bench, just as beautiful as it was when you were alive. But maybe you can see it. Maybe you have been watching all along. I do not know if I believe in heaven or spirits or anything beyond this life, but I believe in love that does not end. I believe in the way your journal has spoken to me across 21 years. I believe in the way Dad protected your memory, even when he could not protect himself. I have a family now. Not the one I was born into, but the one I chose and the one that chose me. Harlan and Della have become grandparents to me in every way that matters. They tell me stories about you. They feed me Sunday dinners. They call to check on me when the weather turns bad. Sawyer makes me laugh every day. He works beside me without asking for anything in return. He looks at me the way Dad looked at you, like I am something worth cherishing. Opal remembers you for me when my own memories are not enough. She tells me about the lavender soap and the peppermint candy. She tells me you were the kindest person she ever knew, and the children, Mom. The children are everything, teaching them to create, teaching them to express, teaching them to believe in their own worth even when the world tells them they are not enough. Every class I teach, I think of you. I think of how you taught yourself piano to pay for college. I think of how you never stopped creating even when life was hard. I think of how you sang to me every night even before I was born. I'm not angry anymore. I was for a long time. Angry at Vivian, angry at Sterling and Margot, angry at everyone who stole you from me and made my childhood so lonely. Angry at the injustice of it all. Angry that I never got to know you, never got to hear your voice, never got to feel your arms around me. But you were right in your journal. Holding on to hatred makes the heart too heavy to carry, so I let it go. Not for them. For me. For the person I want to become. For the daughter you hoped I would be. I did not give them forgiveness. They did not ask for it, and I do not think they would know what to do with it if I offered. But I gave them something almost as hard. I gave them indifference. I gave them the freedom to live their reduced lives without my attention or my energy or my thoughts. I am done being defined by what they took from me. I am ready to be defined by what I build instead. The Art Center is just the beginning. There are plans for more. A scholarship